start in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Flight control, countdown confirmed.
Good morning. Good to see you, those who are joining us online, and everybody in this room. Thank you so much for being here today. We're in the middle of a series called Challenge the Norm, and I'm excited about this. I don't know about you, but I love reading the stories of Jesus and seeing all that he did as he interacted with people. And if you're new today and don't know what we're doing, we're going on a journey through the book of Mark. And there's 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And they all tell the story of Jesus' life. And we're reading from Mark's perspective and how he recorded the stories. And it's amazing to see how Jesus kept flipping culture on its head. You would expect certain things to happen when Jesus would come, and he would do the opposite, or he would say the opposite. He was always surprising people, and he was saying things that would shock people, but he was always sharing the truth and changing lives. And so as we go through this series, all the way up to Easter, the series will end on Easter Sunday. I hope that you are challenged in your life to think about maybe something that's the norm for you that should be different. And it's all about changing the world by changing lives. That's what our church is all about. And so I hope that you come in here on Sunday morning open in your heart and mind to hear something from God. Maybe you've already heard something from God, because I know I have in that time of worship as we're singing praises to God and thinking about the fact that the same God that spoke to Abraham and Jacob and Moses and Mary, the same one that was Jesus performing all these miracles, the God that we're worshiping and we're studying here today. So today, it's Challenge the Norm, bread and water. We're going to talk about that in just a moment. But there was a verse that I shared in week number 1 of this series that was at the end of the story. The story in week number 1, some of you might remember, it was 4 crazy friends. 4 friends that had a friend who was paralyzed. And they wanted to get this guy to Jesus no matter what, because they heard what he could do, how he could heal. And when they got to the place where Jesus was, it was too crowded, so they got up on the roof, dug a hole in somebody's roof, and lowered this man to right in front of Jesus, and he was healed by Jesus. And at the end of that story, Mark wrote this in Mark chapter 2, verse 12. The people were all amazed, exclaiming, "We've never seen anything like this before." And that verse pretty much sums up the life of Jesus and really what this series is all about. We've never seen anything like Jesus before, and we never will again. He's one of a kind. And what Jesus did was absolutely change the world. And I hope that you're reading the book of Mark with us. And we have a few of these devotionals left that are back at the Welcome Center. It has a daily Bible reading from the book of Mark and some questions to make you think. And you can also get it on our church app. And it's free, and we encourage you to read the Bible on your own. It's a 45-day reading plan, take you right up to Easter. So that was Mark chapter 2. In week number 2, which was last Sunday, Pastor Mitch shared a great message about the storm that Jesus calmed in Mark chapter 4. Some of you were here last week. It was an awesome message about the fact that when we're going through difficult times in life, like the disciples were scared for their lives, it was a literal storm that was happening, and Jesus was sleeping on a cushion in the back of the boat, and they woke him up. You remember this? And they said, "Jesus, don't you care that we're about to die?" And that wasn't the right response. And in our lives, whenever we're going through storms in our lives, our response shouldn't be, "Jesus, don't you care?" because he always cares. It should be, "Lord, help me." And so that was a great message last week. I encourage you to go back and listen if you've missed. So we're in Mark chapter 6 today. And you might ask, did anything happen between Mark chapter 4 and Mark chapter 6? Well, of course, there's a lot. There's a lot of action in the book of Mark. And so in Mark chapter 5, we read the story. Jesus encountered a man who was demon-possessed. Not just one demon, but a legion of demons. And in that story, he cast the demons out of this one man, and some of you know, into a herd of pigs. This is true. Read about it. Mark chapter 5. And there was 2,000 pigs that suddenly became demon-possessed. Is that something you'd like to see? 2,000 demon-possessed pigs. And you know what happened? They went crazy and they went running off a cliff. I did a message several years ago called When Pigs Fly, based on that story. And they didn't do very well, just so you know. They came to their death. But anyway, that happened in Mark chapter 5. Then there was a story in Mark chapter 5 about a guy named Jairus, who was a leader in the synagogue, who knew about Jesus and his healing power, and his daughter was dying. And he got Jesus to come to his house to heal his daughter. In Mark chapter 6, it talks about Jesus going back and visiting his hometown of Nazareth. And he was in his hometown, and do you think people loved him in his hometown? No. They're like, who do you think you are? Your dad's just a carpenter. You can't be anybody special. And he was rejected in his hometown. And he even told the disciples, you know what? When you go to places and you try to share the good news of the gospel and they reject you, he said, just shake the dust off your feet and go to the next town. And so Jesus left Nazareth and continued on his ministry. And there's a story of Jesus sending out the disciples. He said, you guys are going to go out. You're going to teach. You're going to preach. You're going to perform miracles. And so they did. And while they were out doing that, we also in Mark chapter 6 have the story of John the Baptist being executed. The guy who was the forerunner of Jesus, he was put to death by Herod. So all that to say, in the second part of Mark chapter 6, we come to this story. In fact, basically, I'm looking at two stories today that happen on the same day. Within 24 hours, two major miracles take place that Jesus performs. One has to do with bread, the other one has to do with water. So we're going to look at both of those today in Mark chapter 6. This first one is a miracle that many of you have heard about, many of you have read about, and it's the feeding of the 5,000. And as I mentioned, there's Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, 4 Gospels that tell the life of Jesus. But they all tell it in their own way, and they don't all share all the same stories. But this miracle was so epic that this is the only one that Jesus performed that's written about in all 4 Gospels. So Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John all tell the story. We're in Mark chapter 6, verse 30. It says, the apostles returned to Jesus from their ministry tour, and they told him all the things that they had done and taught. Then Jesus said, let's go off by ourselves to a quiet place and rest a while, which was a great idea, right? I mean, that is something we all need to do more of. And he said this, why? Because there were so many people coming and going that Jesus and his apostles didn't even have time to eat. So they left by boat for a quiet place where they could be alone. You know, it's pretty awesome when you experience victory in your life, right? Like if you are a fan of basketball and you're watching March Madness, it is so much fun to watch these teams celebrate their victories, especially when they're the underdog and nobody expects them to win. It's pretty awesome, unless it's your team that they beat. It's pretty awesome. But when you experience a victory or when you're going through times of victory, it's fun and you want to be experiencing more of that. And the norm is to just ride the waves of success. And here are these disciples with Jesus. They're experiencing victory. And they're so busy, it says, with people that they didn't even have time to eat. It seems like I always find time to eat. I wish I could find time not to eat sometimes, but they always found time to eat. And they just were with people all the time. And Jesus, what he does in this moment was he said, nope, we're not going to just stay with all the people. We're going to get a break. And what Jesus knew was that our health is important. And not just our physical health, but our emotional health, our mental health, our spiritual health, our relational health is important. So Jesus challenged the norm by promoting the discipline of silence and solitude. He said, we need to get away and we need to get to a quiet place. And sometimes in our lives, there's just so much noise. And sometimes it's good noise. Sometimes there's a lot of good things that are happening in our lives. But when we're with crowds of people all the time, there's going to be a point where we're going to have a deficit. And we need to learn from the example of Jesus, withdrawing from the crowds to a quiet place, even when things are going well. He said, we need to get alone. Whether we're going together, there's 12 plus Jesus, that's 13 people. And sometimes getting alone and getting away isn't just being completely alone, but it's being with people who encourage you, who recharge you, who are good for you in those moments when you've been with the crowd a lot. So Jesus says, hey, we need to do this. In verse 33, it says, many people recognized them, and they saw them leaving. People from many towns ran ahead along the shore and got there ahead of them. Can you just pause for a moment there? Picture this. he gets in the boat to go across the lake to the other side to get away from people. And people recognize Jesus so much. I mean, this isn't even the day of the internet or social media where there was pictures being posted so everybody knew what they looked like. Even in that day, 2,000 years ago, everybody knew about him. They knew about Jesus and the disciples, and they knew what they looked like, and they were following them. So they got in the boat to go across the lake. People ran along the shore to greet them when they got there. So this isn't going according to plan. It says here that Jesus saw the huge crowd as he stepped from the boat, and he had compassion on them because they were like sheep without a shepherd. So he began teaching them many, many things. Now, the boat idea didn't work. The getting on a boat, going to the other side, to get away from people, to get a break, to be with his Father, to be alone, get quiet, didn't work. And so what did Jesus do? Now, in our lives, we make plans, right? I mean, how often do you make a plan? And it may pertain to your work or your schoolwork or something with your friends, or maybe it's within your family. You have a plan, and then people mess up your plan. You know why people do that? Because people are people. And people just mess things up. And when things get messed up that we want to do, that we plan to do, things that maybe are good for us sometimes even get messed up. What is your reaction to that? Because I know a lot of times what I feel is frustration. I get frustrated when I have a plan and I know it's what I should do and it seems like a good plan and it gets messed up by people. I get frustrated. But what Jesus did was challenge the norm. Instead of showing frustration, what did he show? Compassion. If you're a parent of young children, how often do you say, I just need a nap. I just need a break. And I just need them to sleep for an hour. And I just need to lay down. And of course, the moment that you do that, something happens. The other child needs you, or the spouse needs you, or the phone rings, or something happens. And it's so easy to get frustrated. It's not always easy to show compassion, right? Jesus looked at the people and he saw them as sheep without a shepherd. And of course, Jesus refers to himself as the good shepherd. I mean, his biggest mission was to find the lost sheep and bring them to him, bring them to his Father, right? So Jesus saw these people and it's like, okay, I wanted to get away, get some peace and quiet, but the people need me right now. So I'm going to show compassion, and he begins teaching the people. In verse 35, late in the afternoon, the disciples came to Jesus and they said, hey, this is a remote place, and it's already getting late. Send the crowds away so they can go to the nearby farms and villages and buy something to eat. Listen, Mitch said this last week, and I hope you do this. I hope you visualize these stories. Like, you'll get so much more out of this message right now if in your mind you're picturing this happening. It says they were in a remote place. And we're going to read later that there was 5,000 men and their families. So each man had a spouse and a couple kids. That's 20,000 people, all right? So just imagine it's like a festival type of experience. And in my mind, I'm picturing like some of you may have been to a concert that's out in a farm, like they have those out in Baltimore or Millersport, where you're at this big farm and people are bringing blankets or chairs to sit on, and it's just tons and tons of people as far as you can see. Imagine that. And in those places, in our day, what do we have? We have food trucks, right? We have certain types of vending that people can get access to, and they prepared for that. But in that day, in that moment, they had nothing. So the people were hungry, and they noticed that, and they thought, well, here's the logical thing to do. Send them back into the villages. They can go to the restaurants. There's some takeout places back in the villages that they had. There was obviously somewhere they could get food, but not there. So that would be the norm. Jesus allowed them to struggle a little bit with this, the disciples, before he provides the solution. In verse 37, Jesus said, you feed them. Okay, that's nice. With what? With what, Jesus? Okay, with what? We'd have to work for months to earn enough money to buy food for all these people. Can you imagine how overwhelming that would be, feeding 20,000 people? They weren't prepared for that. He said, well, how much bread do you have? They said, we don't know. They said, well, go find out. So they come back. They report, we have 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. Okay. So here it is. Jesus saying, you guys figure this out. Come on, we got to make this happen. We don't want the people to go away hungry. And what Jesus is going to do is he's going to perform a miracle that teaches all of us not to measure a problem or a challenge based on our own ability or what we have. you may have heard it said before, but little can become much when it's placed in Jesus' hands. And I want to give you two questions right now to just challenge the norm in your life. Two questions to think about when you look at this story. Here's the first question. What have I decided in my life is too big for God to accomplish? Take a moment and let that sink in. What have you decided in your life is too big for God? Like for the disciples, the crowd was too big to feed. But for you, what is it that's too big? And maybe it's a certain goal that you've had in your life. You're just like, you know what? I think that's too big now for that to happen, so I'm going to give up on that. Maybe it's a dream that you've had. Maybe it's a healing in your life. Maybe it's a relationship. Maybe there's a new career path. But there's something in your life that you've thought about it and it's big and you've wanted it to happen. You prayed about it. It hasn't happened. You're like, nah, I'm going to write it off. It's too big for God to do. Here's another question that challenges the norm is, what have I decided is too little for God to work with? Like the disciples, like, we got 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. That's not enough. And in our lives, sometimes we're like, we're not enough. I don't have enough. I don't have enough talent. I don't have enough money. I don't have enough people in my life. I don't have enough time. I just don't have enough resources to do whatever it is. So, you know what? It's not enough. And sometimes we shortcut or we short circuit God's work in our lives by thinking it's too big for God or we don't have enough. And the truth is, nothing's too big for God. Nothing is too big for God to accomplish, and little becomes much when we give it over to God. Look at the story, verse 39. Jesus told the disciples to have the people sit down in groups on the green grass. So they sat down in groups of 50 or 100, and Jesus took the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, looked up toward heaven, and blessed them. So, those of you that like organization, you like this, right? They organize. They got people in groups of 50, people in groups of 100. I mean, it's pretty cool how they got them organized, and then Jesus took the loaves and the fish, and he asked God to bless them. Some translations or some of the accounts say he thanked God for them. But here's where I really want you to get into your imagination for a moment and think, if you're one of the disciples, you're one of the 12, and you had all this interaction with Jesus about feeding the people, and you've collected this, and in the moment, and now he's holding them and he's praying. I mean, you pray before your meals, right? I'm assuming most of you do that. I don't know if you're like me, but when you're hungry and you're really hungry and the meal's on the table and it smells delicious, I mean, if I'm the one praying, I'm going to pray a shorter prayer. Or when our staff goes out to lunch and we are going to pray before we eat and we're hungry, I ask Jared to pray because he prays the shortest prayers. I mean, he prays long prayers up here. He prays the shortest prayers before a meal. It's awesome. So I don't know what the disciples were thinking in this moment, but I bet you some of them were doing what I call the holy peek. You know, the peek that some people do during prayer? I mean, when you have little toddlers, they look up the whole time and they're watching, right? Getting them to close their eyes. Some of you do it in church too, I know. But the holy peek. So I'm thinking they're looking at Jesus like, okay, he's holding the bread up. What's going to happen? Because listen, they saw him heal people who had leprosy. They saw him walk. They saw him calm a storm. They saw him heal a paralyzed man. I mean, they were watching miracle after miracle. Like, what's he going to do now? Like, what is he going to, they were probably giddy about it. Like, this is going to be amazing. I don't know what's going to happen. Is when he's done praying, there's just going to be food laying everywhere? What's going on? What is going to happen? So I think they're probably looking a little bit when Jesus is praying, and then Jesus makes this amazing thing happen. We're going to read it in just a moment. But just think about this. Jesus didn't complain that there wasn't more available. He just gave thanks for what he had, and he saw God use it. So here's the story, verse 41. It says, in breaking the loaves into pieces, he kept giving the bread to the disciples so they could distribute it to the people. He also divided the fish for everyone to share. Now, it says he kept giving the bread. Now, if you're reading that with me right now and you're like, I don't understand how that worked, join the club. I don't understand how that worked either. He just kept giving the bread. Some of you maybe have watched a movie about Jesus or a show about Jesus, and you've seen this story, portrayed on the screen. And you're like, the basket just kept filling with bread. I don't know how it worked. It's a miracle. How do we explain miracles, right? He just kept tearing off bread, and it kept being more bread. And it's amazing. And then it says they ate as much as they wanted. And afterward, the disciples picked up 12 baskets of leftover bread and fish. A total of 5,000 men and their families were fed. Now listen, look at that. They all ate as much as they wanted. We're not talking about, okay, everybody gets one Pillsbury biscuit and one fish stick, okay? And that's all you get. No ketchup to dip it in, nothing. All right, that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about all you can eat. When I go, or I know I'm going to a place that's all you can eat, I save up room. I don't eat that day, right? They didn't know this was going to happen. But I know, I'm thinking, I got to get my money's worth, all you can eat. These people weren't expecting this, but they got all you could eat. They just eating and eating and eating. And then how much was left over? 12 baskets. Well, did they start with 12 baskets? No. They started with 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. So what Jesus was saying, look at how much is left. Look at the abundance. But even beyond that, a lot of people think there was an object lesson there. You know, how many disciples were there? 12. So everybody, all 12 of them had a basket to take home with them to remember what Jesus was capable of doing. Maybe, I don't know if that's why, but that's what happened. And it says 5,000 men and their families were fed. So if you multiply that out, 4 people per family, that's 20,000 people. This was the most witnessed miracle of any of the miracles, the most people there. Think about what Jesus did. And how do you handle it when you see needs in people's lives? See, a lot of times we're presented with needs. I mean, if you have relationships with people, you see them struggling, you see them going through things, whether it's emotional, physical, relational needs. And a lot of times it pulls at our heart and we want to meet a need. And what I know sometimes I do is like, what is the minimal I can do to help this person? And what Jesus does is he challenges the norm. He doesn't just meet a need, he goes above and beyond. And I was challenged in my thinking this week is like, how often do I just meet a need when I could go above and beyond in meeting a need? And it's something to think about because Jesus said, you know what, I'm not going to just feed these people. I'm going to fill these people with as much as they want. Now, think about that. When I began the story, Jesus and his disciples were so popular that they could not even get away to spend some quiet time. Now, after this miracle, for 20,000 people approximately, do you think he was more popular or less popular? You know the answer, okay? Of course, he was so popular that in some of the accounts, they were saying that the people were so excited about what Jesus had done that they wanted to make him their king. Like, if you think about it, why wouldn't we want to have a king that could supply us an endless amount of food? This is pretty awesome. I mean, the 12 disciples, they can become his cabinet, or like Mitch said last week, his Avengers. You know, they could be his crew that goes and they rule the nation of Israel. Why not have a guy like Jesus being in charge? And so now, what does Jesus do in this situation? How does he handle the victory? How does he handle this win? It says in verse 45, immediately after this, Jesus insisted that his disciples get back in the boat, head across the lake to Bethsaida, while he sent the people home. And after telling everyone goodbye, he went up into the hills by himself to pray. It says he insisted. After a long, exhausting day, he says to the disciples, get back in the boat. I want you to go back across the lake. I'm going to send the people home. I'm going to say my goodbyes, and then I'm going to go reconnect with the Father. Now, if you remember, he tried to do this earlier in the day, and it wasn't a successful event because the people just crowded around him. But he sent them home, and he's going to get it done. He's determined. He goes up into the hills by himself to pray. Remember earlier I said you can get alone with your friends and with your close family, those that recharge you, but then there's also a point here. We got to get alone with God. We got to have our own one-on-one time alone with our Heavenly Father. So, if you think about the norm, what would be the norm at this point? And what would be the norm when you have a time like they've had? Like when you just fed 20,000 people. What an amazing miracle. Like, I think about this in terms of coaching. Like you watch these coaches for these college basketball teams, and it's fun to watch them get excited on the sideline. But one thing that's fun is watching them celebrate with their team after a win. And a lot of times these guys are like my age, and they're with these 20-year-old guys. And they're trying to do the dances that they're doing, and they're hyped up, and they're jumping around. And some of them are actually good at it, and some of them are like, I would look, and it's embarrassing, it's funny. But what do you want to do when you have a victory? I mean, the team's all hyped, and they're celebrating, As a coach, you just want to go off, I just want to go be by myself right now. No, you want to be a part of that. The normal would be to celebrate. Let's talk about it. I know how it is when I coach a team, baseball team. We like to talk about the game after the game when we won the game and go over the best plays and how it happened and all that. And here's Jesus saying, no, you guys get in the boat. This is not about power. It's not about glory. It's not about becoming the king of Israel. You guys go get in the boat. Trust me. Obey me on this. So they go get in the boat. So if you remember last week, if you were here or you know the story in Mark chapter 4, these guys were in the boat and there was a storm and Jesus was asleep, but he was with them in the boat. This time, they're in the boat again, but this time Jesus is not with them. He says, you guys get in the boat, but I'm going to go spend time with the Father. Here's how Jesus challenged the norm. We need to remember this. We need to be stubborn about seeking out our alone time with God. Jesus was insistent. He was determined. It didn't happen earlier in the day. It's going to happen now. I'm going to spend time with God. And I know for us in our lives, if I talk to most of you, you would say, I agree. Spending time alone with God really helps me in my growth. It really challenges me. I become closer to God. I become more like Jesus. The more time I spend alone with God, the better off I am in my faith. And we all would probably agree with that. But we all allow so many other things to come in between us and God. We allow other things to interrupt that time. We allow other things to become priorities over spending time with God. So I just challenge you. Challenge the norm in your life. Be insistent. Yes, show compassion. Don't get frustrated with people. But also make sure that you find a way to get alone with God. So verse 47. Late that night, the disciples were in their boat in the middle of the lake. Does this sound familiar? Jesus was alone on the land. This is where it's different. He saw that they were in serious trouble, rowing hard, struggling against the wind and the waves. You might realize it was daylight when they got on the boat. It was the evening. These guys that were on the boat, most of them were professional fishermen. So they understood, familiar with boats. They understood sometimes storms do blow up. But they were scared again for their lives. It was so intense. They were wondering if they were going to make it. Deja vu, here we go again. But one thing to understand, anything that God leads you to do will often involve some level of fear or risk. So I'm going to ask you this question. This is an easy question. Who is it that sent the disciples into the storm? Who was it? Jesus did. Jesus sent them into the storm, and they were obeying him, and they found themselves in a scary storm once again. What does that tell you about your life? See, I kind of felt like growing up when I was learning about my faith, like if I just trusted and obeyed Jesus in every area of my life, if I did what he said, then my life was going to be pretty easy. Somewhat, like there would be challenges in life, but it wasn't going to be scary because if I followed Jesus, trust in him and obey him, then things were going to just kind of go pretty smoothly. But they trusted and obeyed Jesus and it wasn't going smoothly. They were afraid for their lives again. Anything that God leads you to do is going to have some level of risk or some level of fear. But Jesus saw what they were going through, like he always does. He sees our struggles. In verse 48, about 3 o'clock in the morning, 3 a.m., Jesus came toward them, walking on the water. He intended to go past them, but when they saw him walking on the water, they cried out in terror, thinking he was a ghost. They were all terrified when they saw him. Now just look at that verse for a moment. Look at what it says there. 3 in the morning, Jesus came toward them. In the same 24-hour period, he feeds maybe 20,000 people, and he also walks on the water. I mean, what a day. But the part that, like Mitch said last week, sometimes there's these little things that are added. You're like, that's interesting that he put that in there. Mark said he was walking on the water toward them, and he intended to go by them. What does that mean? They're on the boat, like, hey guys, I'm just walking on the water tonight. 3 a.m., like, no big deal. Like, they weren't going to notice that? Like, that he was going to walk on by? I don't know. But anyway, in the story, that's what happened. So they were scared. They were already scared for their lives. They were in terror, and then they see a person. They thought it was a ghost. Makes sense, right? They were terrified when they saw him. I was thinking this week, does fear ever really leave our lives? Do you ever get to an age or spiritual maturity where there's just no more fear? Nothing scares you anymore. there's nothing to be afraid of anymore in life. I think it just changes forms. I remember there used to be this popular Christian bumper sticker. If you have it on your car, don't be offended, but it's this. I've seen it on signs. No Jesus, no fear. No Jesus, no fear. So what's that saying? Saying, if you don't have Jesus in your life, there's a lot to be afraid of. But if you do know Jesus, there's nothing to be afraid of. That's cute. But I don't think that's real. I don't think that's true. Because just because I have fear doesn't mean that I don't have faith in Jesus, that I don't trust Jesus. It just means that there's some scary things that happen in life. There's some things that are risky. And if I want to avoid growth in my life, I can try to avoid anything that's scary. But if I do that, I'm going to live a mediocre at best life. But if I want to live a life that really honors God and pleases God, and I want to grow in my life, fear and growth are kind of a package deal. And when you make a decision to follow Jesus, it doesn't mean that all fear is gone. So Jesus walks on water, challenges the norm. Verse 50, Jesus spoke to them at once. He said, don't be afraid. Take courage. I'm here. Okay. Then he climbed into the boat. What happened then? The wind stopped. They were totally amazed. Remember, this happened before, guys, okay? They're totally amazed, and this part gets me. It's like they still didn't understand the significance of the miracle of the loaves. Their hearts were too hard to take it in. It's hard to imagine all that they had already seen, and they still weren't fully getting it. But here's Jesus, again, challenging the norm, challenging their fears, saying, don't be afraid. This isn't the first storm that you've encountered on the lake. They're amazed. Here's what I want you to think about in terms of challenging the norm. I mean, when you think about this idea of having fear, what are we supposed to do with that? Are we supposed to try to just be intent about overcoming our fears, list our fears out, and intentionally try to beat them in our lives? I would say no. Instead of focusing on how we can beat our fears and how we can fear less, what we should do is focus on how we can trust God more. Like, don't focus on all the things you're afraid of. Focus on all the things that God is, on who he is, on his character. Learn more about Jesus and learn more to give your faith over to him. Put your faith in him. Trust him more in your life. Because I don't really think that most of us have what I would call as a fear problem. We have a faith problem. And the more that we grow in our faith, the more that we grow in our knowledge of who he is, the closer we become to God, the less we have fear in our life. But don't focus on the fear. Focus on growing in your faith. So they finished the journey in verse 53. They crossed the lake. They landed at Gennesaret. They brought the boat on the shore. They climbed out, and guess what happened? The people recognized Jesus at once. They ran throughout the whole area carrying sick people on mats to wherever they heard that Jesus was. And they begged him to let the sick at least touch the fringe of his robe, and all who touched him were healed. The barrage of people continues. No break. I was thinking about this morning as I was going over my message last time, and I thought, imagine one day getting to heaven and just starting to talk to different people in heaven and having conversations. And people say, yeah, I was one of those people that Jesus healed. We're like, what story were you? And they're like, there's no story in the Bible about me. You know, the end of Mark, when it says a lot of people came and they just touched the edge of his robe and they were healed. I was one of those. I'm like, can you imagine all the people that Jesus healed? I mean, that he didn't even speak to, didn't even like reach out and touch. They just touched his robe and were healed. Amazing stories. The life of Jesus. I mean, Jesus challenged the norm. So today, as we wrap this up, what is God saying to you? Is God challenging you about silence and solitude, about being stubborn about that time alone with God? Is God challenging you in the way you meet needs and saying, hey, you meet needs, but you could go a little bit above and beyond in some people's lives? Is God challenging you about the norm in your life when it comes to frustration? Like when people are being people and they mess up your plan, do you get frustrated or do you have compassion? And maybe what God is speaking to you about today is the norm in your life is to live fearful. There are people that I know that live with so much fear in their lives, and they focus on their fears all the time. Instead of focusing on your fear, maybe God is saying to you today, focus on trusting me more, learning about me more. And as you learn about me more, your fears will slowly dissipate in your life. Let's pray. Let's bow our heads. Let's close our eyes. No holy peeking, please. I believe that God is speaking to hearts today and working in lives today. And if God's working in your life today, I would challenge you, whatever that norm is in your life that shouldn't be the norm, that you need to challenge, that God's speaking to you about, that you would just commit that to him this morning. Say, God, you know what? I need to do better at this. God, I want to challenge the norm in this way in my life. I don't know what it is for each of you, but something you could do right now that's just symbolic of acknowledging that God is speaking to you about a norm in your life that needs to change. With nobody looking except for me, if you say, Steve, I acknowledge that there is something in my life that's kind of the norm that I need to challenge, and I need God's power in my life to do that. If that's you, would you just slip your hand up real quick? Say, I need to challenge the norm in my life. Thank you. Man, so many of you. God, I come before you today humbly asking you, God, to work in our lives. God, you've seen every hand that has been raised at this service, at the last service, those who are sitting in their living room or driving in their car or somewhere listening to this message right now. God, I pray that you will empower them to do exactly what your Spirit is laying on their hearts. God, you know exactly what they're going through right now. You know exactly what they're facing. And Lord, the norm is something that we all fall into in our lives. And sometimes normal is good, but there's times in our lives where we need to challenge the norm. And so, God, I just pray that you would give them the power and the strength to do that in their lives. Lord, I pray if there's anybody that doesn't have a personal understanding or knowledge of their faith in you, I pray that you would encourage them today to take a step towards you, to come talk to someone about that before they leave. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.